presente Dr. Gary Charles, quien dictará la conferencia inaugural de este encuentro, así como la organizadora de este simposio, doctora Alejandra Vázquez Alvarado. Asimismo, saludamos académicas, académicos, invitados e invitadas, estudiantes, funcionarios y funcionarias que hoy nos acompañan. Enseguida, y para dar el saludo inicial de esta conferencia, dejo con ustedes al director del Departamento de Economía, doctor Carlos Llévenes Ortega.
Ahí sí. ¿Se escucha bien? Estimado profesor Gary Charles, distinguidas autoridades de la universidad y de la facultad, apreciados colegas académicos y académicas, y queridos y queridas estudiantes, es para mí un inmenso honor poder abrir este simposio titulado Preferencias sociales y desigualdades, actualizaciones en economía del comportamiento y estudios experimentales. Un evento que congrega destacados expertos y entusiastas del ámbito académico en un espacio de diálogo y aprendizaje sobre temas esenciales para comprender las dinámicas de nuestras sociedades actuales. El estudio de las preferencias sociales ha ganado creciente relevancia, particularmente en un contexto donde las disparidades y tensiones sociales son un constante desafío. Y que este sea el tema del simposio no es una coincidencia, pues desde sus comienzos nuestra universidad ha manifestado un sólido compromiso con la justicia social. Hemos ido más allá de ofrecer educación de calidad, siendo pioneros en la promoción de inclusión y en la distribución equitativa de recursos. Este profundo compromiso con la equidad social se alinea con el objetivo principal de este evento: profundizar en las preferencias sociales, entender su impacto y reflexionar sobre cómo éstas se reflejan en las desigualdades presentes en nuestra sociedad. Para lograr dicho objetivo, el enfoque del simposio utiliza herramientas provistas por la economía del comportamiento y los métodos experimentales. Y ese prisma, bajo el cual se busca estudiar las mencionadas preferencias, tampoco es aleatorio, pues en nuestra facultad y departamentos se han desarrollado y realizado investigaciones de alto nivel durante los últimos años, utilizando justamente herramientas provenientes desde la economía del comportamiento y metodologías experimentales, ya sea para estudiar la forma en que aprenden los estudiantes, la toma de decisiones en el ámbito financiero, la forma en que los individuos toman decisiones al momento de recibir una pensión de vejez o respecto a los incentivos para vacunarse contra el COVID. Al abordar temas de preferencias sociales, economía del comportamiento y métodos experimentales, es esencial destacar la influencia del profesor Charles, pues sus contribuciones han sido cruciales para el avance de estas áreas. Gracias a él, hemos comprendido que las personas tienen interés en promover el bienestar social y están dispuestas a hacer sacrificios por el bien de todos, y en particular hacia aquellos menos favorecidos, cosa que no era parte de la perspectiva tradicional. Asimismo, nos ha revelado que la mayoría posee alguna forma de preferencia social, mientras que aquellos que actúan únicamente movidos por intereses personales son una minoría. Es decir, la mayoría de las personas no solo actúa en función de sus intereses individuales, sino que pondera el impacto de sus acciones en la comunidad. Y por tanto, sus contribuciones están intrínsecamente relacionadas con el principio de equidad social que promueve nuestra querida universidad. Con este simposio, no solo buscamos ser un foro de discusión, sino también un catalizador para futuras investigaciones en este campo. Reafirmamos así nuestra dedicación a esta área de estudio y esperamos que este encuentro fomente un diálogo constructivo. Permítanme ahora hacer una pausa para expresar nuestro sincero agradecimiento a la profesora Alejandra Vázquez. Su incansable esfuerzo y dedicación en la organización del evento realmente son dignos de admiración. Gracias a su labor, no solo hemos logrado concretar este simposio, sino que también hemos podido avanzar en nuestra línea de investigación en preferencias sociales, economía del comportamiento y métodos experimentales, a nivel de facultad y de Departamento de Economía. Por último, les invito a participar activamente en las discusiones, con la visión de un futuro en el cual el entendimiento de nuestras preferencias y desigualdades guíe a decisiones más informadas y justas, y que este evento marque un hito en nuestra continua búsqueda de comprender y moldear la economía en pro del bienestar social. Muchas gracias.
Agradecemos las palabras del director del Departamento de Economía, doctor Carlos Llévenes Ortega. Enseguida dejo con ustedes a la académica del Departamento de Economía y organizadora de este simposio, doctora Alejandra Vázquez Alvarado, quien estará a cargo de la presentación de nuestro conferencista inaugural, doctor Charla.
Buenos días a todas y a todos los presentes. Antes de presentar a nuestro invitado, me gustaría expresarme por su generosa disposición para agendar su visita con anticipación aquí en Chile, lo que nos permitió planificar un agradecimiento especial a la Vicerrectoría de Investigación, a la Facultad de Administración y Economía, Departamento de Economía, a todos sus funcionarios, en especial a la logística e informática, entre otros. También la disposición e involucramiento de varios estudiantes y también gracias a las personas que conforman el comité científico, la organización y a todos ustedes aquí presentes este día. Muchas personas me han preguntado por qué esta imagen, esta imagen que ustedes observan aquí de plantas. Bueno, normalmente la han visto en el SAS, ¿no? Es una imagen que tiene plantas, flores, naturaleza, muestra el sur de Chile. ¿Y esto qué tiene que ver con economía, actividad económica, con inequidades y preferencias sociales? Quizás muchos esperaban alguna foto con algún rascacielos, con lugares que mostraran situaciones de pobreza o situaciones de inequidad. Sin embargo, esta imagen encierra una metáfora. Las plantas que allí ustedes observan, con esos colores, violeta, rosados, producen una leguminosa que se llama lupino. Y gracias a la investigación en ciencia y tecnología del Centro de Genómica Nutricional, desarrollaron una mejora en esta leguminosa para producir una proteína vegetal más sustentable, que genera gran impacto en la industria alimentaria y va en línea de una producción sustentable con el medio ambiente, generando de 2 a 6 veces menos emisiones de gases de efecto invernadero. Por tanto, gracias a la investigación y al modo de hacer ciencia, encontramos que esta planta no necesita ni de elemento químico para su cultivo. Más bien, una de sus características fundamentales es que es regenerador del suelo. Actualmente, campesinos de la zona sur de Chile se han asociado en cooperativas y conjuntamente con este Centro de Investigación e Innovación han patentado esta innovación de esta leguminosa y con el apoyo de redes tanto públicas como privadas están potenciando y generando valor en la producción, creando productos de alto valor nutricional que hacen bien a quienes los consumen, así como a quienes los producen, creando una cadena de valor virtuosa en este sistema económico, ecológico y social, donde el impacto es a 360 grados. Crea empleo, innovación, nutrición sana, fertiliza naturalmente el suelo, genera muchas sinergias. Con esta motivación que está dentro de esa gráfica, es que me gustaría iniciar mencionando conceptos claves como cooperación, confianza, reciprocidad, gratitud, intenciones, entre otros. Estos conceptos están a la base de las preferencias sociales, un tema que inspira la aventura científica de nuestro invitado Gary Charles, con quien profundizaremos este tema durante este simposio, quien al leer en algún momento alguna anécdota de su vida, soñaba con ser beisbolista y científico. Gary Charles ha llegado a serlo, Nace en Chicago en 1950, estudia matemáticas en Michigan y en los años 70, durante estos tiempos de guerra entre Estados Unidos con Vietnam, prefiere dedicarse a conocer el mundo, realizando variadas actividades comerciales y ya en los años 2000 inicia su doctorado en Economía en la Universidad de Berkeley y desde allí no se ha detenido. Ha escrito más de 115 publicaciones científicas en reconocidas revistas internacionales, como la American Economics Review, Econométrica, Experimental Economics, Science, Journal of Labor Economics, entre otras. Ha trabajado con científicas y científicos de alto nivel. Lo podemos considerar uno de los expertos más prominentes en las áreas de la economía experimental y del comportamiento. Ha creado una carrera innovativa, inspirando a muchos jóvenes y contribuyendo a generar un cuerpo de pensamiento y reflexión en ámbitos como son la teoría de juegos y comportamiento, economía laboral y experimental, incentivos, comunicación, diseño de contratos, experimentos en el campo y toma de decisiones, preferencias sociales y actualmente también indaga temas de inteligencia artificial. Bueno, podríamos decir mucho más de Gary, pero dejemos que sea él quien nos hable de sus inquietudes científicas en las que está profundizando. Y por tanto, Gary, en tus palabras, podrías iniciar con decirnos qué es para ti la economía del comportamiento y experimental.
Can you guys hear me? If you can't hear me, raise your hand.
¿Me escuchan?
What was your question? Oh, we're not doing slides first. We're talking about me first?
Okay.
Oh, I should speak more slowly, right? No, it's okay.
Daily.
So what do I think about experimental economics?
Yes.
So I went to graduate school at the age of 41, and I had explored the world quite a bit and got some sense of how people actually behave. With experiments, which is mainly my research tool, I look at what people actually do instead of what standard economic theory says that they should do. I'll try to give you a small example. So there's a game called the chain store paradox. And in this game, you can cooperate or not cooperate. You go, let's say, 100 periods. And when I was in class, Matthew Rabin said that in the last period, people aren't going to cooperate because it's the last period. There's no reason to be nice after that. There's no strategic reason. And I said, But if I were playing this game and I'd cooperated for 100 periods, I'm certainly going to cooperate in the period 101. It's really bad form. That's not how people really behave. And he argued with me, but of course I was right. So how people actually behave isn't really the same as what people predict them to do. And what happened with me was that I spent so much time traveling around the world, getting to know how people are in different situations, that it gave me an interest in trying to do behavioral and experimental. In another sense, it was taking my poker playing into the laboratory. I used to play poker semi-professionally, among other things that I've done. So I've always thought experiments were very cool because you can really see what people do. And lots of times the theory isn't quite right, but by doing experiments you can improve the theory and you can be more descriptive about how people are. So I see experimental economics as a tool for learning how people actually behave. It's also useful for testing standard theory, which I've done as well. But I like it. It's a bit like going into psychology, but not necessarily. But I think if you're going to consider yourself to be a science, you're supposed to embrace the scientific method, which involves experiments. So I think it's kind of a necessary part of the field.
And behavioral economics, what do you think about this field?
What do I think about it?
Yeah, you can explain us?
I think that it's a useful description of how people are. But you can look at all sorts of things. You can look at, what's a project? So I did something, in fact, maybe I'll present it tomorrow, on eliciting risk preferences. And I'm looking at why people don't really, the risk preference measurements aren't really very accurate. So we tried something different, which was to make people in practice rounds write down what happened and roll the dice and see the outcomes. And we found that doing that actually did change what they said in their preferences. So that theory really has nothing to say about that. But this is my intuition about how people behave. If you want someone, if you go up to someone, a friend of yours, and you say, here's 100 tokens, and if you, whatever you invest, it pays 2.5 to 1 with 50% chance. Whatever you don't invest, you keep. They're going to look at you and say, what kind of question is that? They're not going to really make any sense out of your question, but we invite students into the lab and do the same thing. So this is methodology. So, but that really wasn't your question. What do I think of behavioral economics? I think if you don't understand how people are behaving or why they're behaving like they are, you're missing a lot. In terms of policy, you're missing a lot that you could actually do with people. So for example, if people have a cooperative instinct, maybe if they know that other people are also being cooperative, they're going to do better. I had dispute resolution experiments. One of my very first experiments was on that point. So if you have a signal that the other person's really a good guy, let's say you have a friend. Let's say you have someone else that you're arguing with, but you have a mutual friend. And the guy says, oh no, that guy's all right. And he says to the other guy, oh, you're all right. Maybe you get together and you can actually reach a cooperative solution because you know something about the other person. There may be ways to build cooperation. There may be ways to use the social aspirations that people might have. Is this working okay with the translation? Yeah? Okay, good.
Now, okay. Lo diré en castellano, veamos si tú también lo entiendes en inglés. Bueno.
Yo puedo hablar un poco.
¿Puedes hablar un poco?
Verdad, yo puedo.
La próxima vez vas a hacerlo en chileno, ¿eh? La explicación. Bueno, ahora quizás vamos al centro de este tema que tiene que ver, tú eres uno de los expertos en preferencias sociales. Entonces, para ti, las preferencias sociales, ¿qué son? ¿Y cómo te interesaste a ella? ¿Y cómo ves la relación con la economía?
social preferences, the term social preferences was introduced into economics, I think, by Matthew Raven's 93 paper. And tell me the question.
¿Cómo te interesaste en el estudio de las preferencias? ¿Y cómo?
Well, I've been interested in how people behave ever since I started hitchhiking around the world when I was 21, 22 years old. I'm really interested in how people behave. And when I was a first-year student at Berkeley, we were exposed to social preferences. And to me, this was a nice description of how people actually behave. Like I said, if I was cooperative for 100 periods in period 101, I'm not going to go bad and try and steal. I'm not going to do that. And I think that other people are like that. And to me, that's very interesting. To me, it's a way that people can get to better social outcomes. I've always been interested in getting to better social outcomes, or even on an individual basis, how to do the best that you can to make good decisions. And I look at it as trying to get cooperation in a difficult environment, the world, because people are not necessarily cooperative. And it also matters, so when we say that people have social preferences, or most people have social preferences, I think that's true, but it depends a lot on the environment. So maybe I'd like for other people to make more money, but suppose that you've done something that's not so nice to me. I'm probably not going to, I can give you an example. I was going to look for a blackboard, but that's all right. So this is a game out of the Charla and Rabin paper that was published in 2002. So the first guy can make a choice in which each person gets, gets 550, or 550, okay? Or the first person can pass the choice to a second person. And that person has a choice between getting 400 for each person, or 750 for the first guy, and 375 for the second guy, okay? Now, if you don't have the first move, it's about 50%. People go about 50% on that. And if you do it with a third party that doesn't have any interest in the payoff, it's 54%, we found. But when you have this 550 choice, and the person doesn't choose 550 for each person, but restricts you to getting at most 400 instead of 550, people aren't very happy about that. They don't really feel like sacrificing money to help out this other guy who just screwed them. They're not very happy about it. So do you always have social preferences? Well, you can argue that you have a social preference there which is negative reciprocity, which I think is what's going on. So it depends what you call a social preference, but I'm interested in it because it's how people really behave. And that's what interests me. Are we going to do my slide?
Podríamos, sí,
All right.
ya. Tú recientemente has trabajado en un artículo con Ernst Fair sobre preferencias sociales, ¿no?
What a nightmare that was.
Cuéntanos acerca de este último trabajo, que así también podemos comprender en qué estás trabajando últimamente sobre preferencias sociales.
Well, to be honest, I don't really work so much on social preferences these days as I used to. Working with Ernst was an interesting experience. Ernst is the only person in the world that thinks that I can't write. This is amusing. But he does things his own way. He's the king of social preferences. That's been his career from the beginning. I do a wide variety of different things because I'm interested in a lot of things. But we wrote this book. Actually, in some sense, my biggest contribution to this paper was getting Ernst to write it. So at one point, I had to conspire with the editor against Ernst because he wasn't getting the thing written. He was making excuses. And the editor wrote to Ernst and said, hey, I'm leaving. Are you going to have this done in time? And Ernst says, no. And then I write to the editor and I said, you know, Ernst responds to fires in the neighborhood. So if you give him something like a deadline, that might be effective. So then the editor gave Ernst a deadline. And then Ernst asked me by Zoom, he said, were you responsible for that? And I said, of course it was me. But so I got Ernst to do the paper. My own interest in this, of course I'm interested in social preferences, and these paradigmatic economic games are just simple games that I'll show you and we can talk about them. Fundamental properties, this chapter is only about payoff distributions. This is only about distributional, not about reciprocity. So I did a lot of work on this, although mostly it was 20 years ago. Merit, luck, and risk. So does it matter if someone is deserving? Luck's important too. A lot of this is from these guys in Norway and Bergen who looked at issues like luck. And suppose there's a certain outcome, how do you feel about it? If you're lucky, do you share more than do you pay by merit? Do you pay by luck? The US is much more, you care about merit, and Scandinavian countries is more about equality, regardless. I'm very interested in belief dependence. And for the very kind and untrue words she said about me. I'd like to thank Carlos for his kind words. It makes me think he actually might have read some of my stuff. Probably not true, but it looked good. So I wanted to thank everybody and thank all of you for attending this talk. This might be the most attendance I've ever had at a talk. And you saw I took pictures of it, so. But I veer off topic very easily. So another thing that I've done with, you can call it belief-dependent social preferences, is something called guilt aversion. And what that is if you think that another person is relying on you to do something good for them and you disappoint them, the more you think that they believe that you are going to do it, the more guilty that you feel. So it's a second order thing. I care about how you think, what you believe about me, which is a little tricky to follow. It's easier to give examples of it. But I think it's very important, and this is a way that you can, I don't want to say manipulate people, but you can get people to behave more cooperatively. So I had an experiment. It did very well. This experiment was published in a top journal. And the issue in the experiment was you can send a message. So I'm looking for a blackboard again. Okay, never mind. You can send a message to the guy who's going to be the first mover, and you can say anything you want except for, I'm the girl in the third row in the red dress, and here's my phone number. You can't say that. But they could send a message of any sort to the other person to try to influence them to trust the person. Because the first mover can trust the other person and potentially do very well, but it's in the second person's interest to not cooperate and take more money. So to trust the other person, it's a little bit hard because self-interest says you don't cooperate. But if you have a person saying a message, it might change things. So here's a message somebody said. It says, I swear upon my mother's grave that I'm going to choose to roll, which is cooperate. And you know what? The person who got that message believed the message, and the person who said they were going to do that did that. Because you don't say, I'm going to swear on my mother's grave if you don't mean it. Maybe you don't have mothers in your graves, but I do. I would never say that. So it's a way, again, not to manipulate, but if I can give you something that's a gesture that I'm really a good person, like this other issue that I said, then you can get some level of trust. What I teach in my negotiation class, though, is that you build trust incrementally. You make yourself a little vulnerable, and the other person makes themselves a little vulnerable, and eventually you work your way up. So I find this stuff interesting because the world that we live in, especially in the U.S., I don't know about here, it's a mess. It's a mess. You have people here fighting with each other. This is not the way to go. It's not just the U.S. Look at the Middle East. I mean, it's bad. We're a long ways from getting to where it would be good, but I think it's the only hope. Oh, I didn't finish this. Self-image and social image. So this relates a little bit to guilt aversion. You care about how you feel about yourself. You also care about how other people see you. Both of these things are important. So for example, why don't I steal candy from babies? Well, because I take myself with me wherever I go, and I know that I did this thing, and I don't feel good about doing that. So I don't steal candy from babies. Now, if I were dying and I needed this candy to live, well, I would take it then. Circumstances do matter. But you care about how you feel, and you certainly care about how other people see you because that affects your lives. I never liked it when people walk onto my tongue. Anyway, back to the issue. So you care about this stuff, and this affects your behavior. I won't say much about the last part. Labor relations is a very obvious thing because in labor relations you have a lot of personal contact with people, and social preferences are going to be stronger than, say, in a market where you really don't meet people. So they're going to be stronger in labor relations. I don't really know how it affects macroeconomics, but I can imagine that it would. Contracts, I've done a lot with contracts. Institutions are important. Incentives are critically important. Contracts, the point that Ernst made early on, and I agree with him, is that contracts are necessarily incomplete. Circumstances come up that you didn't imagine. And with the incompleteness, if you have something like social preferences or something that will smooth things through, you can get to a good place. Okay, so contracts are important. Institutions are vitally important. You look at some countries that don't have institutions, they don't do very well. Incentives is a big issue in economics. The reason that experiments were accepted into the field, if to the extent that they are, is that you can pay people for their choices. And economists believe that paying people for their choices makes people give meaningful responses that they thought about. Get some water. I'm running out of water. With politics, so this goes on now. This goes on now, and sometimes it's not so. Yeah, you get the water. I'll hold this because I make a mess everywhere. Sorry, folks. So you look at somebody like Donald Trump. I know you don't want to look at Donald Trump. I don't want to look at him either. But he uses social preferences. He uses the negative part of social preferences. He gets people really angry, really upset with other people. And this is a powerful emotion. There are other ways to do things. Winston Churchill had some great comments that motivated people. Franklin Roosevelt had comments like that. But when you have the podium, you can motivate people, you can appeal to their social preferences. And I think that's what elections are mostly about. I won't talk about summary and outlook. You're not going to let me show my slides, huh?
Okay.
These are my slides.
You want to talk more about your slides, or I can ask you?
Well, there's a slide before this.
La anterior, por favor.
Before this.
Antes. Esa.
Yeah. All right. Good. This is the real introduction. So we have this paper, as I described. We wrote it. It's a revision. It's not forthcoming yet, but they're going to take it. Water. Wrote this paper. What are social preferences about? Well, this is a working definition. People with social preferences, they don't maximize their own material payoff. They sacrifice money either to help or to hurt somebody else or to affect somebody else. They will sacrifice their own well-being, their own material well-being, because they're sufficiently happier by doing what they're doing with their sacrifice that their overall utility is better, that they feel better. So if you see, I don't know that you have this in Chile, but if sometimes you see a charity, you give money to a charity. I know you have that here. So you give money to a charity, maybe you feel better about yourself because you gave money to a charity. Maybe you feel, maybe you gave, I don't know, I'll do the local currency. You gave 5,000 pesos, which is not very much money. You gave that to somebody, and you feel really good about it. I'll give you an example. I was at a thrift store in California, and there was an old guy. The old guy was my age. There was this old guy. He looked a lot older, though. And I'm 73, by the way. So this guy, he was looking at a piece of furniture, and he really wanted it. I could see it. But he was poor. He was either homeless or he was almost homeless. He really wanted it. And he was trying to figure out if he, and I'm sitting in my car. My son went in the store to buy something. I'm sitting in my car. I get out of the car, and I talk to the guy. He really wants to buy it. I bought it for him. It cost me like $10, $15. I bought it for him. It was a great thing to do. What I said to the guy was, there but for the grace of God, go I. Right? You're a guy, I'm a guy, we're about the same age. I've had some breaks, you haven't had so many breaks. Here, take it. It's a gift from me. I felt much better, plus I got this story that I could tell. So that's the characteristic. You might sacrifice money to help somebody, but also you might sacrifice money to hurt somebody. And negative reciprocity tends to be a lot stronger than positive reciprocity, actually. So you sacrifice for other reasons, for a bunch of reasons. The innovation in Charnis and Raven was that you care about the total payoff, which somehow was ignored in all the literature before then, which is kind of crazy. That was our innovation. So you've seen this, we discussed, this is a later slide. And the evidence here, and so maybe this is what Carlin saw, the purely self-interested subjects are actually a minority, although it depends on the circumstances whether you do it or not. And the lab experiments, they help you understand what actually happens if you do things like you give unequal wages and you let people know the wages aren't equal. What happens? I mean, what happens with inequality? What happens when you try and cut somebody's wage? They don't like it. There's a lot here. There's a lot here. And there's a lot of evidence. So I'm done with this. You can go to the other slide now.
Yeah.
2 slides. That one, yeah. Okay, these are games. And there's another slide too. These are games that we think of them as paradigms, illustrating some particular notion. And the first one, actually, the first one was the ultimatum game. But I'll talk about the ultimatum game first, out of order. So the ultimatum game was published, the first paper was published in 1982 by Werner Gut. And he had this really simple idea. So suppose that you have 10,000 pesos, and there's another person that you're paired with, they're anonymous, you don't know who they are, you'll never meet them, and you have you can divide the 10,000 pesos between you and the other person. So this is what it says here. You make a proposal to divide the money, and the responder can respond to the proposal. So one common proposal would be to split it evenly. You get 5,000, I get 5,000, how about that? If you give offer an equal split, people almost always accept it, okay? But suppose that you have your 5,000 pesetas, you have 10,000 pesetas, and you say, okay, I want to keep 9,500, I'm going to give you 500. Maybe you don't like that. I'm going to keep 9,999, I'm going to give you 1 peso. Well, economic theory says you should take the 1 peso because it's bigger than 0. What do you think people do? They say, you can keep that 1 peso, and by the way, I'm rejecting your offer, and you're not going to get this 9,999 pesos yourself because you're too damn selfish. You don't have to say that part, but that's what happens. The self-interest predicts you make the lowest possible offer, and it should be accepted. That's not what people do. And if you think about it for a second, it's not what you would do either. Now, this scales out. If it's $1 billion and you're only going to give me $1 million, you know, I might just take the $1 million. It's a lot of money, right? So it doesn't necessarily scale up. But principle's important too. So the second one is the dictator game. So they take this idea of the dictator game and they take away the second mover's response. Now you can do, as a first mover, you can unilaterally decide the ultimate split of the money. You can keep it all. Many people do. You can split it in half. Many people do. And then you get some intermediate things. So the second person doesn't have any ability to turn it down, so you can be as selfish as you want, but you still have to deal with your self-image. And your self-image tells you what you think is the right thing to do. This can also transfer into social image. A friend of mine did this in Sweden. He had people make choices in an ultimatum game, in a dictator game it was, a dictator game. And then if you won, if you got up on the stage, you would get, I don't know if it was winning or losing, your choice would be revealed to the audience. And now you have a social image concern. So in any event, the dictator game, you can be as selfish as you want. Some people are, some people aren't. What would I do in a dictator game? I would probably keep 2/3 and give 1/3, something like that. I mean, I get to pick, I should have some advantage, but I don't want to be too selfish. That's just me. Okay, third-party punishment game relates to this. So this is a game, you have somebody, let's say it's well, I don't know, it's just some sort of game. And the first mover can make a choice, and it's very selfish. And the second party doesn't really have much they can do about it. Let's say it's a dictator game, and the first person was selfish in the dictator game. And the second person doesn't get very much. There's another person who's watching this, and they can punish the first mover for being selfish. Now, what does theory predict? Well, if it's costly punishment, you should never punish. And knowing that, the first mover in the dictator game, the dictator, should just ignore that there's a punishment option. That's not what happens. When there's a punishment option, it changes the behavior. People give more. Is that social image? Well, it is kind of social image. You don't want this person to think that you're a bad person. Okay? Trust game is a very interesting game. This first came out in the 1995 paper, Berg et al. So this is a game where you're trying to see if the other person will respond to a gift. The problem is you don't really know if it's a gift or if you think the person's trying to make more money themselves. So you have 10 tokens, I have 10 tokens. You can send me as many tokens as you like. Whatever you sent me is tripled. The experimenter triples that, okay? So let's suppose that I send you or you send me all of your tokens. And now I have 40 tokens. I could, for example, send 20 back, and now we each have 20, and we each started it with 10. That's clearly a better social outcome. On the other hand, I could send you all 10, and you could just keep everything. And then you make 40, and I make nothing. It's risky to, quote-unquote, trust the other person. And in experiments, it's not obvious that you're going to get people that are being trustworthy. People don't necessarily give you the money back. In fact, in this game, and usually people lose a little bit of money from passing money. But it increases the total social payoff. It's best for the group, so it's socially efficient. But self-interest predict no money is sent by anyone. And of course, that's not what happens. That was a similar thing as I talked about in the guilt aversion situation, where someone says, I swear to God, that I swear on my mother's grave that I'm going to choose the right thing, that inspired the first person to trust the second person was going to do the right thing. It's the same story. So a lot of what I've done, one of the topics I've pursued a fair amount is communication. And I think this is a critically important issue. In life, you communicate with people. People talk about contracts. How can you have a contract if you don't have communication? So what I find with communication is that you can get a lot better social outcomes, lots better social outcomes. I think it's a vital tool. And experimenters really didn't use this very much until the 2000s. Yeah.
Existe un...
Questions instead. You can show there's another slide of this and
Hay una pregunta.
I'll cut it quickly. Because this is more boring. Okay, there are models. I actually will talk about this a little bit. So the first model was actually Bolton and Ockenfels. So here's the story. Bolton and Ockenfels had come up with this model, and they even wanted to see my data from my 1996 dissertation paper. And I sent it to them, and they came up with this model. Well, I didn't like this model very much. And Ernst was apparently, the story I heard, I don't know if it's true, there was a conference in Switzerland, and Ernst saw this and had an idea based on what he saw, took it to Klaus Schmidt, and they developed a model that I like better, but I still don't like that much. So the Bolton and Ockenfels model, well, let me talk about the Fair-Schmidt model first. So the Fair-Schmidt model says that you like money, but you don't like payoff inequality. So if the payoff inequality, you can trade off your money against the inequality. I'll give you an example of a decision task. So you're going to get 600 units, and you can choose whatever number of units you want the other person to take. Not to take, you're going to give them. So you're going to get 600 no matter what. The other person is going to get between 300 and 1,200. And you choose the amount. So Fair and Schmidt says that everybody should choose 600 because there is no payoff difference and you're getting the same amount of money, so you should choose equality. What does social efficiency say? Social efficiency says you should choose 1,200. This person didn't do anything to you. Give them more money. It doesn't cost you anything. So what happens? Well, 10% of the population chooses 600. 74% chooses 1,200. Not so good for Fair-Schmidt. What was my favorite choice of anyone? This was great. Somebody chose, this was in Barcelona, it was Pesetas. So we give the guy, he says the other person assigned $5.99 to you. And the guy laughed. We gave him his 600. He insisted on giving us 1 peseta back. It was the funniest thing. So somebody had social preferences that they wanted to be ahead, but they didn't want to be very much ahead. They just wanted to win just by a little bit. So Fair-Schmidt doesn't pick that up. Not at all. Bolton Ockenfels is a similar model, but what Bolton Ockenfels had as a problem, well, there's two things. One is that they do this aggregation over the average, your average payoff, everybody else's average payoff versus yours. Fair and Schmidt does it on an individual basis, pairwise, you to this person, which I think is more realistic. The second thing, the big problem with Bolton Ockenfels is that you care just as much about coming out ahead as you do about coming out behind. It bothers you the same. Fair and Schmidt, it bothers you more to come out behind, which I think has to be psychologically realistic. So these models were published earlier, and I started getting ideas about this in '99 and talking to Raven, and I talked Raven into joining me on the paper. It was one of my, I'm good at persuasion. I talk people into joining me on papers. It's a useful ability. So this model is a little different than the other ones. Here, you also care about money, but you care about this thing called social welfare, okay? And social welfare means that you care about the total payoff, and you also care about the lowest payoff of anybody in the group. So you'd like to increase the total payoff, and you like to increase the lowest payoff. The last part of that means that you tend not to like inequality. So it incorporates inequality, but it also incorporates this idea of raising the total social payoff. This is just the distributional part of it. It gets into negative reciprocity. It gets into some other things too, but this is just the distributional part of it. So we do have negative reciprocity, which the other models don't have. No such thing. So it's a much richer model. It's also a mess. It's a really messy model, which makes it hard to work with. But it's much more accurate than the other ones. He said modestly, but it's true though. I got one more slide, but you don't have to show it.
For the time, also we want to... perdón.
Yeah, we don't have to show any more slides.
¿No más slides?
It's
No.
okay.
Bien. Está abierta la posibilidad para también hacerle preguntas a Gary. Entonces, desde el público, si existen algunas preguntas que quisieran realizar al expositor.
Usually I make jokes, but I don't know if the jokes would work here.
Bueno, en sí también en este paper que tú escribiste, y Fer escribió
Which one?
también, el que acabas de presentar,
I was teasing.
menciona la importancia de entender los determinantes de las preferencias sociales. ¿Podrías explicar cómo se investiga estos determinantes, ¿no? ¿Cuáles son los factores que se consideran más influyentes en la formación de las preferencias sociales?
So, for example, if you want to look at negative reciprocity, then you can change the situation. You can see what people do in response to this offer, what they do in response to this offer in the ultimatum game, and you can see that. So there's two techniques. One is that you can observe what people are doing, and you can make inferences from their actual behavior. This is usually what's done. There is another approach, which is kind of radical for economists. You can have people at the end of the experiment explain why they did what they did. So I have a technique that I use. I actually think I invented this. I've never heard about it somewhere else. So we tell people that you get a show-up fee. It used to be $5, now it's more. I think it's $7 now. But then, at the end of the experiment, I tell them, here's a questionnaire that I'm going to give you, and I'm going to give you $2 more for filling it out. And when you give people, when they know they're getting paid specifically for doing the questionnaire, they seem to put more effort into it. This is not, I mean, is this a social preference? It is a social preference. You're giving them extra money. They see it as extra. You could have said, I'm going to give you $9 to start with, and you have to do this questionnaire. But it's more effective to give them $7 and then the extra $2. Lots of experiments. This gives you some idea of what's driving it, if you just ask them. But usually it's you just infer what's going on. So if you want to see how much people care about people versus how much people are worried about being rejected, you compare the dictator game behavior to an ultimatum game. Dictator game, you just can take it all if you want to. So a person might take it all in the dictator game, but they might offer 50-50 in the ultimatum game because they don't want to get rejected. So actually, one of the things we say in this paper, maybe you read this part, Ernst was making this point that we don't actually ask people how they form their beliefs or how they do these things. And it's really important. And there isn't that much done on it. It's all indirect inference, except when you ask people, which I think is a good approach. But economists, it's funny, experimental economists don't tend to like it, but all the labor surveys are just asking people questions. So I don't know. But that's another approach. I think it's a good one.
También en ese paper tú mencionas el tema de, bueno, la reciprocidad y los incentivos, ¿no? ¿Cómo tener atención a los incentivos? ¿De qué manera en los experimentos que...
How can you not pay attention to incentives? I mean, they're right there in your face. You're reading this thing. You get paid this for this. I mean, you could do it without incentives, but you get different behavior without incentives. So there's a famous paper about risk preferences and eliciting risk choice, Holt and Lowry, famous paper, published in 2002. And they do different treatments. They do one with normal incentives, where there's a risk involved and you can take the risk or not take the risk. Then they have a treatment where it's 10 times the pay. And they find that people at 10 times the pay are more risk averse. They don't want to take chances so much. And they also have a treatment where it's not incentivized at all. And here people will take lots of risks because they don't have to pay. And you can make inferences off of that. But it's usually considered that you want to pay. That is, after all, how it got into the journals in the first place. So with incentives, I don't know, people come to the lab experiments. They come to make money. They're keenly aware of the incentives. I don't think they ignore them. Now, if you did this out in the world, maybe that wouldn't work. But with students in the lab, it does work.
Igual, en
This is very useful, by the way. I didn't think I'd like it, but it's very useful.
Bien. Bueno, no sé si hay alguna pregunta.
Good, we got some
Aquí.
people here. You choose. You're the boss, you choose. La jefe. Hola. ¿Qué
Hola.
tal?
Thanks for the talk.
Welcome.
I'm not an expert on experimental economics.
I'm not really either, but that's okay.
Okay.
People, you know what? You become an expert and you realize how little experts know.
How maybe, yeah.
Go ahead.
And, in macroeconomics, there is recently an approach that has been favoring a more equal society,
Yeah.
not because of altruism, but because an equal society ensures all the people against bad shocks, you know. So
You talk about the Piketty kind of stuff?
yes, and
Yeah.
the Eugene's agents model by
But, you know, there was this thing you may have heard of called communism.
yeah,
It didn't work out too well. That was equal, except it never worked as equal. I'm not in love with capitalism, but communism didn't work at all.
no,
So I'd like to see a more equal society, something like Norway. Of course, Norway has all this money, it's easy, but something where it's not like the wealthy are up here and the poor are down there, where it's like closer together. That's what I
perhaps I didn't explain
Yeah.
myself properly. What I meant is that even in the most classical approach, the
Yeah.
Minnesota stuff, it is good to have a society which is not very unequal in the sense that it has some insurance for bad shocks to all the people. In the sense that
Yeah, you have some
can,
social insurance, yeah.
so you can be a highly educated people, but then you got a very bad disease or you have an accident or something like that.
Yeah.
And in that respect, it seems that solidarity is not solidarity in the sense that you care about the others because you can be in that position at some point. So my question is, for social preferences, is altruism a way of also being individualistic in some sense? Why do we care about our kids? Why do we care about our parents? Well,
So I'm going to argue that there's no such thing as altruism. You give something to someone because it makes you feel better. Your utility went higher. So you could do something so nice that increases your own self-image, but the only people that have nothing to gain are people who have a perfect self-image. I don't think there are any of those people around. So you always get something. I don't think there's any pure altruism. But there's conditional altruism, there's circumstantial altruism, and there's a lot of that. And now you're getting into another area. You're getting into group membership and identity. So people feel much stronger about people that are in their own group, not in some other group. And you get this identity politics stuff that goes on, not just in the U.S., all over the place, I guess. So the idea to have a more just society is to not have these small identity groups, but maybe you can have identity on a local level, but you also need to have identity on a larger level. So now the identity in the U.S. has to do with whether you're extremely left or extremely right, and your identity as a quote-unquote American is kind of out the window now. So you need not just local loyalties or membership, but something bigger. And I think the way to get there, if you can do the Norwegian approach, that's good. It would be tough in the U.S. That's not the culture.
Yeah.
But it's not the ideal culture. It could be changed, and I think that's the right direction. So in the U.S., this would be called socialism.
Yeah.
I don't care what you call it. I think it's a better way to go.
Yeah, I guess Chile is similar. I mean,
Now I'll probably get in trouble. This is being taped. No, I'm not recommending socialism, you guys. I just think that's what this is called.
Yeah.
All right. I got in trouble once. I did a talk and they recorded it, and somebody complained about something I said. I had to. It was really crazy. So I should be careful, but I'm not.
Yeah, thanks.
Did that come close to answering your question?
Yeah, I guess I understand.
You're very kind to say that.
No,
Thank you.
I mean, I really,
Thank you.
thanks for you.
I saw another hand up somewhere. No?
Hola.
Yeah?
Mi pregunta es bien.
I can even see you. It's even better.
Está bien en español, ¿no? Da igual. Sí.
Yeah, I got this thing here.
Ok, súper. No vi el concepto de externalidad en tu definición de preferencias sociales. Entonces quería preguntarte si esa omisión es deliberada o uno entiende que es explícito la relación con las externalidades.
I don't know if it matters what you call it. This is kind of what you're saying. So yeah, it is an externality. We just don't use that expression much in experimental. I don't really know why. We've just never used it. So it's not a deliberate omission. That much I can tell you. I think it's something that people have just missed, honestly. And you can say that's impossible. But I can tell you that people don't think of things. I think of things that it turns out nobody's thought of them before. And that's just not just me, but you'd be surprised. So people think that, I don't know if you people are interested in research, but I have this view of the research landscape, which is that mostly it's really dark. Not very much has been found. And people are like shocked by that. They say, oh no, all the low-hanging fruit has been picked already. It's just not true. So what I like to do is I like to go out into the darkness. And the darkness is where you can find things. What do you see out in the darkness? You occasionally see a light pole. And that's where something's found. And under the light pole, you see a lot of researchers looking to do follow-up experiments. But some people like to go out into the darkness. And maybe you walk into trees, maybe you fall into rivers. But if you find something, it's new. So I like to go out into the darkness. And I get banged up, but I find things. And I like to find interesting new things. This is one of the ways that I see experiments being useful. Perhaps the most useful paper I ever wrote was about, with Uri Gnesi, about incentivizing people to go to the gym and to exercise. So we did this with students, and we found that if you make them go twice a week for a month, people that hadn't been going regularly, which we operationalize as once per week, would start to develop the habit of going to the gym, presumably because they found that I actually enjoyed going to the gym and they'd never really done it before, and this got them off their butts. This hit the New York Times and we got called by Chase Bank or something. And then they realized we don't know what the hell we're doing with the Chase Bank, but this got going. This is actually something that happened. And this was just an idea. So this is benefiting society in some sense, although not monetarily perhaps, but you can get people to engage in better behavior for themselves, and presumably that helps other people too. That was useful. That was useful. So that was something that didn't really have much in theory at all. It's just something we tried. So I like to do exploratory research too, because I find it's informative. And this going out into the darkness stuff, that's exploratory research. That's literally exploratory research. I think it's useful. To me, it's the most enjoyable thing. I don't like to do follow-ups. But if you want to be a researcher, I just tell you, do what you find interesting. Do what you find interesting. And I did something else that, I don't know if it works for other people. I got a reputation as being able to take an idea and put it into an experiment. And so I had a lot of people bring me ideas to try to make into experiments. So I did other people's ideas to some extent if I thought the upside was really good. So I have a few of those papers too. But mostly you should do what interests you. You shouldn't just do things that bore you. I mean, the reason that people generally, well, I don't know, people maybe get into this field in the US because there's a lot of money in it. But mainly, real researchers get into things because they're intellectually curious. I'm really intellectually curious. I don't understand a lot about the world, and I'm supposed to be an expert. And I learn more every day. And you know how I learn? I talk to people. It's underrated, talking to people. You learn. So I'm way off the topic, but this also goes to social preference. This is learning how people are, which is my thing. My idea with social preferences is to be aware of the problems and try to overcome the problems and get to good social outcomes. That's how I see it, really. And you have to accommodate the negative stuff because it's going to be there. More questions? Once he gives a microphone, I'll be able to see the person. Now I see you.
Is that?
Castellano.
Is it on? Okay. So, I was just wondering, from your perspective, from the vantage point that you have within academia, so where do you think the field is going to?
Just a second. I'm getting the Spanish translation, which is interfering with my understanding of your English. Try it again. Sorry.
So where do you think the field of, let's say, experimental or behavioral economics is going to now? Where is it the tendency off to?
That's a good question. Behavioral has kind of gone in the direction of nudges, trying to get people to influence them to like donate blood or something with different nudges, different conditions. For example, on your driver's license, there's a box whether you want to donate your organs or something like that. I think that's what it is. And if you leave it that if you don't check the box, you don't donate, you don't get much donation. But if you put in the box that the default is that you do donate, well, now you get a lot of donation. So that's one of the things that behavioral economics behavior was kind of going towards. I think that behavioral has to make some changes. I think that this nudge stuff is kind of done now. In terms of experimental will just continue to move forward. Mostly experimental is seen as something that can test theory. And that, I think that's probably what most experiments are, theory related. The other stuff, the wilder stuff that I do, I think that communication is going to be a big thing because we don't have much of a handle on it yet. But experimental is going to remain a tool, and it will be a useful tool for various purposes. The old Al Roth experimental economics book published in '93, he talked about things like whispering in the ears of princes, which is policy related, or just looking for facts, searching for facts, which is what I call exploratory research. So you have different things that experiments can be useful in a number of different ways and different purposes. I don't see that stopping. I'm not really sure about what behavioral is going to do though, because behavioral is a bit more like psychology. And there was all this talk about interdisciplinarity, but it just never really happened. I don't think it's going to. Here's the problem with interdisciplinary research. You're an economist. The other person's a psychologist. Where do you want to publish the paper? You want to publish it in an economics journal because it's professionally useful. The other person wants to publish it in a psychology journal because it's professionally useful. This is the big problem. I forget where I was going. Did you know that there are two things that happen to you when you get older? The first is that you lose your memory. I can't remember the second. You thought that was a joke. It's true, though. Oh, I'll tell you another joke. I don't know if this one will work, but I'll try it. Oh, you'll get it in Spanish. That'd be interesting. Ah, yes, my joke. My joke. See, I wasn't kidding about forgetting. There are these two guys in a bar. And the bar's on the third floor of the building. And one of the guys points out the window and he says, outside that window, there are these really strange air currents. And it's like you can just float out there. And the other guy says, that's ridiculous. You're out of your mind. And the guy says, no, look. I'll show you. He jumps out the window. He's floating out there. Jumps back in. And the other guy says, that's unbelievable. I'm going to try it. He jumps out the window, splat down to the ground. The first guy goes back to the bar, and the bartender says to him, you're a mean drunk, Superman. Didn't work. It's a great joke. It's all right. It's all right. Do you know what a 7-course Irish meal is? It's a 6-pack of Guinness and a potato. Jokes don't work. It was a good way not to get more questions, though. Are there more questions?
Well, thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
Sí, ¿se escucha? Sí. So you mentioned in your previous response that you thought that experimental economics should go more into studying communication.
I think that's a rich area that it could be going into.
Okay, so my specific question was, are you referring more to how to communicate findings of experimental economics, or more studying
No,
how
studying
communication
communication within it. So, for example, there's different forms of communication. There's a simple form where you just send just a message without any words almost, just pick a number. Then there are things where you say, I swear on my mother's grave, right? So different forms of communication matter as well. Communication to the general field, that's something else. But I think that, so I'm actually interested not just in communication, I'm interested in something that's deeper. And once I ever finish my autobiography, which is taking forever, my second book is on persuasion. Persuasion is everywhere. And that's really at the root of communication. You're trying to persuade something. When you write a paper, you're trying to persuade the reader that what you're saying makes sense. Persuasion is everywhere. It's really everywhere. I find persuasion fascinating. I don't see that as a direction for the field. I see that as something that really interests me, and I'm not just going to do experiments about it, because the experiments they don't cover things. So there's nonverbal persuasion. There's a lot of it. If you're dating someone, which I don't know if people still date, this is the 21st century, I don't know. But if you're dating someone, maybe you'd like to get intimate with this person. God forbid. Do you persuade them with words? No. But you do persuasion. All right, it could be with money. You could give them a diamond ring or something. That's fine. But no, persuasion's everywhere. And I've talked my way out of a lot of dangerous situations in life with persuasion. Here's a situation, not a dangerous situation, but it's something I did. You can do the same thing. Anybody here ever been to Iguazu Falls? No one's been to Iguazu? Oh, it's spectacular. You really should go to Iguazu. I'm going there again for the third time. It's spectacular. So there's a famous hotel there on the Brazilian side called Hotel das Cataratas. And it's a fabulous hotel. It's right by the falls, the only one. So I showed up there. I was 38 years old, and I was even wilder at 38 than I am now. And I take the taxi cab 10 kilometers from the airport and show up there at Cataratas. And there I am in the taxi. And the guy at the front desk says, "Do you have a reservation?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, we're full." And I said, "Well, I'm here." What's he going to do? Is he going to call me a taxi? No, he found me a room. It was persuasion. It wasn't nasty persuasion. It was, "Oh, I'm going to make trouble." It was like, "Well, I'm here." It was easy. It was really easy. You can do persuasion it's not that difficult. Here's a different kind of persuasion. I don't recommend this, but it worked. So I had my first start in academics in 1997, in Barcelona. It was the only chance I was going to get. I was already 46, 47 years old. So, where was I going with this? What was it? How was it? Before that? Oh, persuasion, right. Now I got it again. It was a bad story, but you'll hear it anyway. So I was going to go to Barcelona, and I had, my son was 7 at the time. My older son was 7 at the time. And I wanted my wife, so I was going to be there for 3 months, come home for 3 months, go there for 3 months, and be home for 3 months in the summer. That was my plan. And I wanted my wife to come in the middle of the 3 months to visit me, because 3 months was a long time, especially with a young son. She didn't want to do it. No, I don't want to do it. What did I do? I said, 3 months is a long time. I might get lonely. Well, she got mad. She slammed the door of the bedroom. But then she did come over in the middle of the 3 months. So I don't recommend that, but it can be effective. It's persuasion. It's everywhere. So to go back to your point, communication is important, but what I think is more interesting is persuasion. But I don't see the field getting there for quite some time because it's much more difficult. There are some papers on persuasion. There's this thing on Bayesian persuasion, which really isn't about persuasion, but it's okay. So I think this is what's coming. Does that help? Thank you. Boss. You guys are the bosses here. Come on, these bald guys can't even raise their hands for very long.
Thank you, Gary, for being here.
Thank you.
And thanks also for organizers. What's your opinion about artificial intelligence these days?
Oh, that's a big topic now. I'm kind of worried about artificial intelligence, to be honest with you.
Specifically regarding their role in experiments. Because
so I have a paper on this.
Not only from the practical point of view, but also from the
So here's the practical point of view I was going to get to. So one of the problems with experiments, so there was this thing called the pandemic. It's a wonderful experience. And people did more experiments online. There's a problem with doing experiments online, which is comprehension. You don't know if people understand. In a physical lab, people can ask questions. It's hard to do that online because it can go all day long. No one's going to sit there and be available 24 hours a day. But you can use AI to train an AI to answer questions, which is going to help in a practical matter. On a theoretical basis, I'm kind of worried. So I have a second paper on creativity in artificial intelligence. because as researchers, many of us worry about losing our jobs, basically, because AI might take everything over. And I don't know enough about it to be concerned, but I know there are some big guys who are really smart that are very concerned about it. And my intuition is that it is a concerning problem. I don't know how to limit AI because it just keeps growing and getting better and better. And if you've read as much science fiction as I've read, at some point you reach sentience. At some point they're actually alive or intelligent. I'm worried about that. I've read so much science fiction where the robots take over in the future, and I don't really see what's going to prevent that here. So I'm concerned. I think AI is extremely useful. I know people that use it to write first drafts of their papers. It's really useful. I understand students write lots of papers with AI now. Maybe that's not so good, but this is where I see the trend is people are going to be using AI more and more, and they'll be less self-reliant, and I think that could be a problem. So I am concerned about AI. I think it has tremendous possible benefits, but it has to be controlled in some manner, and I don't know how to do that. That is my opinion. I don't know if it's based on anything real, but that is my opinion.
Yeah, but do you think there... Can you hear me? No.
I hear you. Of course, I don't hear you from the microphone. No. I hear you from sitting next to me. Oh, that's working.
Yeah, but I heard that some machines are even answering, filling forms and making decisions in experiments. So, what do you think about that? I don't want to be persuaded.
I think that AI does not have my intuition, and I think my intuition is important.
Yeah.
So I don't see. This is something that's been discussed. Can artificial intelligence design experiments? They can help a lot with the experiments. They can record numbers. There's a lot of things you can do that they can help with the infrastructure. But actually having the idea, I think that's a lot harder. Have you ever looked at jokes made by AI?
Not as good as not as good at yours.
Oh, get out! You must be an administrator, right? Jesus Christ! How come nobody laughed at my jokes? I have millions of jokes. Yeah, I think that you can use it, but I just don't see it having the creative potential. So the experiment that I did, well, that my co-author did in Italy, she did it online. But she took creative, we had an old experiment on it was published in 2019, paper on creativity and incentives, and what we did was she took the creative products that were made by people in that experiment and then had AI answer the same questions, and then had students evaluate how creative, which they liked, which was better. And we had two types of characteristics of questions. One is where things are more well delineated, so it's like clearer what you're trying to get to, and then there are cases where it's like wide open, like paint to painting, right? And we found that the AI did well in the more well-defined things, but when it was the wilder stuff, AI didn't do well at all. Interesting. So I take that as like some hope for the creative people that do the more exploratory research. But I think that AI could handle the more standard kind of research. Maybe. But I don't think you'll ever see intuition in AI. Maybe I'm wrong. I hope I'm not wrong. Thanks for the question.
Yeah.
Oh, 12 hands.
There are two last questions, and then...
You're the boss.
Yeah, two last questions, and we can conclude. Sí.
I like it when I get questions.
Gracias.
Hi.
Gracias por venir, primero que nada.
Oh, wait.
Bueno, mi pregunta va relacionada a los problemas que puedas tener a la hora de tratar de replicar el mismo paper en otros contextos. ¿Qué problemas de replicación has presentado o se te han presentado? Dado que me interesa investigar justamente en economía conductual y si esto me ayudaría bastante a orientar mi posible tesis de pregrado y magíster.
So it's actually a very interesting question. Most things that are called replications in experimental economics pretty much do exactly the same thing as the original. Now, oh, sorry. Don't get old. Yeah, don't get old. Demasiado viejo. It's not good. No bueno. Anyway, most of the replications do exactly the same thing. They set it up. The big replication studies that people like Camera did, they grilled me on everything that I did, and they replicated it. But what you're coming up with, well, maybe it's not what you're saying, because you're saying it's a different context. Do you mean it's a different context or a different subject pool?
Principalmente, yo lo veo, por ejemplo, dado el experimento que realizaron, quizás hacerlo aquí en Chile no daría exactamente el mismo resultado. Y los costos asociados también serían bastante altos.
Okay. So it's not so much, it's the subject, it's the location. So you could do the same exact experiment, and you're concerned that you get different results in different places, right?
Claro.
Yeah. Okay. That can happen. But it's not so common. So there is this idea, there's something that they call WEIRD, which in English is, they call it weird. And so white, it's like white, it's the developed world, the rich, developed Western world, right? And the point that they make is that it's not the same in the developing world. And that's true. But I don't think that a replication in another location is a problem. I think it's an opportunity, really. There's another idea with replication, which is actually a better idea, and I thought that's what you're getting at, and maybe it is. And that is, replications shouldn't really be exact replications. They should be slightly different so that you can see how robust the experiment is. And nobody's doing that. Nobody does that because the referees would kill them. They say, oh, you should have done it exactly the same. But you learn a lot more the other way. So I do think it's an opportunity rather than a problem. If you do the ultimatum game, you're going to get results that are pretty similar almost no matter where you go. Well, all right, Chile is still, it's the Western world. People are pretty well off in Chile, especially compared to a lot of South America. I think you'd get the same pattern of behavior that you would get in most of the northern hemisphere Western world. I think you would. Now, some things wouldn't be the same. Some places, for example, take the trust game that I put up there. Some places there's lots of community trust. Let's say Norway. But if you go to some other places in the world, I'll pick on you. Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe is tough. It's really tough. And people may not be as trusting. Oh, I did this in Albania. I had an experiment in Albania. They're not trusting very much at all. They're really not. And it's just the culture. It's the culture. Some things are different, some are the same. Sorry? Communism. Yeah, that worked out really well, communism. China still communist, isn't it? Not really, but yeah. Is that helpful?
Sí, muchas gracias.
You could just say no and I do more. But, okay. So there's one more question, is that right? Hello.
Hola, muchas gracias. Bueno, mi pregunta era sobre qué opinión tiene usted sobre la diferencia entre experimentos de laboratorio y experimento en terreno. Y si usted tiene alguna preferencia.
What a lovely topic. What a lovely topic that is. I have a paper. What a surprise. All my conversations start with I have a paper. I have a paper called The Virtues of Lab Experiments. It's just been submitted to Experimental Economics. And I co-authored with a bunch of old-time people that have been around forever. They call us Dinosaurs United. 4 of us are in our 70s. So one of them might have turned 80 already. And we have one young guy. I like lab experiments. Why do I like lab experiments? There's a whole bunch of reasons. One of them is comprehension. I think that's vital. If you don't get comprehension, you don't have anything. You have noise. So my first priority is comprehension. But you learn from people asking questions. If you're in an experiment and you're in the room, you can learn from other people. If it's a social kind of experiment where there's issues of social proximity, maybe it makes a difference if you see that there are other people versus online where you don't see that there are other people. Maybe you don't believe there are other people when you're in an online experiment, so if you sacrifice money, you're just throwing away money. Whereas if you see people, so one of the techniques that I've used is in an experiment, I'm going to end up with 2 groups, but I start them off in the same room so that everybody can see that there are other people. And then I split them into 2 rooms, but they know there's somebody else there. So this goes to credibility, and online your credibility is lower. It's really lower. And it bothers me. There's certainly a place for online experiments. There's a lot of advantages to them. They're less expensive. You have access to people that you wouldn't be able to reach otherwise. You can get executives that are fooling around on the internet and they might do something like this. You'd never get them to come into the lab. So online experiments are useful, and the idea here is to try to improve online experiments to make them more comparable. That's what this other idea about AI answering questions, that would go towards that. So this is evolving. I see online, I see them as being complementary, actually. I don't see them as being dividing, but I like to see both. I do. I also learned something which maybe not on the topic, but one study doesn't really prove anything. I used to think I could do one study and that was proof. You need at least a few studies finding something before you can really start to believe it. I learned that, but do your experiments, do them honestly. There's been some instances of people being accused of cheating, although those are really psychologists. I know some of them too. Do you guys know who Dan Ariely is? Dan is a super smart guy. I don't know why he did what he did. I don't understand it. Anyway, never mind. But all of my experiments are replicated. Is that because I'm lucky? Maybe. But it's also because I'm honest. I do exactly what I say I'm doing. And they replicate. And to your point, they seem to replicate in other places too. So they replicated one of mine, the Promises of Partnership paper in Singapore. Now Singapore, all right, it has money. It's not really a Western culture. So, does that help with the question? I could send you my paper, The Virtues. If you send me an email, I will send you my paper, and you might find it interesting. You will find it interesting.
Thank you, Gary.
So I go back to bed now? There's a desperate person here. Desperado.
Okay.
Go ahead. Oh, you don't have a microphone. You can be loud like me, right?
Hola, profesor.
Hola.
Bueno, mi pregunta va más enfocada en la teoría microeconómica con respecto al equilibrio general. ¿Cómo este experimento de las preferencias sociales se contrapone a la teoría que nos muestra el equilibrio general con respecto al primer teorema del bienestar, el segundo teorema del bienestar? Bueno, yo igual tengo una intuición acerca de que este mercado claramente es imperfecto, entonces se muestra un nivel de precio diferente. Entonces, ¿por qué este nivel de precios que se muestra, este sistema de precios, no beneficia a aquella persona que coopera en este mercado, con respecto a la que no coopera y la que no interactúa en el mercado, ya que se muestra beneficiada por esta persona que interactúa en el mercado?
So, you really see very little discussion of equilibrium in experimental economics. But I would say that there's a funny sort of thing if you look at an equilibrium. There's sort of a dynamic equilibrium. So you may do things not for their present benefit as much as you do it for the future. Here's an example. It's kind of a dumb example. But the main thing is I don't think that experimental economists think very much about general equilibrium. I just haven't seen it hardly at all. So it's a topic that I think it's wide open for exploration. What was the example I was going to give now? Oh, I don't remember it. That's okay. But what I was talking about was a dynamic thing, a dynamic equilibrium. I actually don't know if there's such a concept. I just sort of made it up. But if you're doing something nice for somebody else, you can say that you're not getting something back, but you could see the world in some sense as a repeated game. And maybe you do things to help you for the future. Oh, now I remember my example. I was in Rio with my wife, and she wanted to go see pão de açúcar. I don't know how you say it in Spanish, but sugar loaf in English. Why is it translating into English for me? I don't know. That's weird. Anyway, so she wanted to go to this thing. I didn't want to go. It's across town. You take a taxi, you sit in traffic, and then there's going to be a long line of tourists to get on the thing. I don't want to do it. But then I said to myself, you know, if you don't go, you may have regrets that you didn't go. Not only that, but if you go, you will have memories that all of the future yous will appreciate. So why don't you sacrifice a little bit of your welfare now for your own benefit down the road? So I went. All of the me's after that me that had to make the sacrifice have been very happy that I did that. Is that an equilibrium? I don't know the answer to that question. But it's a dynamic, it's something that's dynamic. And it does go with, say, self-image. So it's not it's not necessarily repeating in that case. But the real answer I'm trying to do, if this thing doesn't fall off my head, is I don't think there's much of general equilibrium. I just don't think there is. Or if there is, then I just don't know about it. So it would be interesting if you could find anything on this topic. I don't think there's much. There may be some really early stuff. So if you look at, here's the Brennan Smith's very first stuff, his 1962 paper. He did the double oral action, where they found that they could do this experiment with a small group of people, and the predictions of theory with respect to price and quantity traded were spot on. And it replicated in lots of environments. And that's what helped experiments get in. So that is general equilibrium, I suppose. But there isn't that much of it. And I would say probably there's more of it in the early days than now. People aren't doing that now at all. I never see a paper like that, never. And I get a lot of papers at Games. I'm an editor there. So I don't think there's much. If that's something that interests you, it's wide open.
Thank you for the answer.
You're welcome. Thank you for being bold enough. I'm going to give you 2 pieces of life advice. These are very good pieces of life advice. I give them to all of my students. If you want something in this life, ask for it. Ask for it. People may not know that you want it. And they don't like to say no. And the other thing, this is a little harder to do, but it's how I got into graduate school. It's how I've done a lot. I was rejected at Berkeley initially, and I went in there and I, let's call it, persuaded them. It's kind of the same way I persuaded my wife. I persuaded them. Oh, I lost track of where it was again. Oh, the second advice, right. So it does come back. 10 years from now, it won't come back. So what do I do when someone says no to me? Someone, I ask them something and they say no. What do I do? I say, what do you mean no? And they say, well, I mean no. And I say, what do you mean no? And they say, okay. You think that's nasty? It's not that nasty. I went into Berkeley and they rejected me. And I knew it was age discrimination. I was 41 years old. And then they knew that I knew it was age discrimination and I was going to make trouble. And that's how I got in. It's the truth. Absolute truth. Absolute truth. So persuasion's everywhere, but just if you can't do the second one, just do the first one. The first one's easy. A small example, I know we're over time, but this is a nice example. I was in China. I was in Beijing. My host took me to the airport. She had 2 of her students with her, and she found that I needed to get a stamp in my passport. So there's this line. So we get in this line. China has lines. You wouldn't believe the lines in China. And way down there, there's a window, and there's somebody down at the window, and he's taking people. But armed with the knowledge that with my advice from the day before, which was ask for things if you want them, my host saw that there was another window way down there, and there was someone sitting there, but the window was closed. She walked all the way down to the window. She knocked on the window. The guy opened the window. She showed him my passport, and he stamped it. And we were done. And if she doesn't ask, you're still in line. It's not such a bad thing to ask. Really, it's not. I highly recommend it. If you take one thing from this talk, take that.
Thank you, Gary. Thank you for sharing with us your life, your anecdotes.
Pieces of it, Anecdotes,
y muchas gracias a cada uno de los presentes que también con sus preguntas, con su escucha, han hecho parte de este momento y sin duda que quedan preguntas, pero creo que Gary estará atento de responderlas también en el futuro. Así que gracias, Gary, por estar aquí. Y continuamos.
Agradecemos la interesante presentación que nos ha entregado el doctor Gary Charles, con la que ponemos fin a la inauguración de este simposio. Muchas gracias por su asistencia y les invitamos cordialmente a disfrutar de un coffee break a la salida del auditorio. Les recordamos a los participantes de la sesión 1 que esta comenzará a las 11 horas en la sala 1002, ubicada en el piso 10 de este mismo edificio. Muchas gracias.